All right, everyone, welcome back to Munro Live. I'm Kevin, and with me is Armin. For those of you curious, he's roughly 39.5% more dense than Jordan. Lots of comments about him being essentially scaled up Jordan. Behind us here, we have a 2022 Porsche Taycan. So for me, this is pretty cool. I've always kind of admired Porsches from a distance. They definitely don't fit within kind of my bracket of vehicle that I could, chase down and get at this point. But it's interesting to see nonetheless. We've had many years ago some experience with the Macan, but I wasn't on that project. So this is kind of like really for me, like a first kind of chance to kind of look through a modern Porsche, which is pretty interesting. And to see kind of what I would say is maybe different trade-offs between some lower high volume vehicles and then a performance oriented vehicle itself. So the one we have here is a relatively base model itself. It's got the smaller battery, and it is a rear-wheel drive vehicle, so it does not have the front drive module installed in it.
Yep.
So you want to just kind of get to it?
Yeah, definitely a very interesting vehicle. This has some overlap with the Panamera, even though it is supposed to be its own platform, shared with the e-tron, Audi e-tron. But when we come to the front of a vehicle, we first usually take a look at the SORB strategy or lack thereof on this vehicle. And Kevin has seen a lot of different vehicles in the luxury segment, and just like other vehicles, there's not too much SORB. Like if you come in here and look up, maybe this corner might be better. You see some extrusions in the front here, this member right there, and above, if you look straight up here, there's another one. But there's no specific SORB tusk or anything like that. And Kevin, Kevin and I took a look, and really there's not a whole lot of evidence.
No, and this is, it might come to a surprise for some people, but this is not uncommon. So we've looked at a lot of vehicles. SORB, or small overlap rigid barrier, is a third-party test. And when it kind of came on the scene in like roughly around the 2015 timeframe, and you saw vehicles that were designed for it, and then vehicles that were not designed for it, and then the discrepancy in performance, or the delta in performance, is pretty drastic. But in general, it was not uncommon, essentially, to see vehicles with asymmetric SORB countermeasures very early in production, until essentially IIHS announced that they would be crashing vehicles on the passenger side as well, and then you would see mirrored strategies. But for some vehicles that we looked at that maybe have a luxury model built off of them, whether it's like a unibody or body-on-frame construction, we would see on high-level, high-trim vehicles that don't get essentially run through a lot of these crash tests because of how low their volume is, they'd be absent of SORB strategies or SORB countermeasures. So this has gone through essentially the full gamut of Euro NCAP. It's performed relatively well itself, but one thing that's interesting is I think given how low the volume is, and it's just not necessarily tailored to that, if you will. But when we look through it, a lot of the front end appears to be aluminum, so it does have aluminum extruded bumper itself with crush cans. And then a lot of, based off some diagrams we've seen online, of the front end structure is aluminum. And then essentially, once you get into the passenger cell itself, there's like a various mixture of various high strength steels, which makes sense, especially with EVs, with the occupant protection and battery protection itself. So that's one thing that's interesting, but it wasn't surprising to me in the least bit that there's essentially no offensive SORB strategies. And when you look at the hinge pillar, it's relatively shallow in depth, and I don't say it can't do a good job, but it's not indicative of essentially vehicles where we see a more defensively oriented strategy where they're taking up a lot of that energy and just essentially stopping it abruptly at the hinge pillar. But when we look at this in the front here, I think everyone's probably been looking at essentially this I don't want to say a mess, but this Medusa
bowl of spaghetti
of coolant passages from a thermal system. So lots of valves, there's pumps that kind of tuck and route through here. The one thing that's kind of interesting about this, it's not a manifold, but it looks like it is absolutely ripe to be converted to a manifold itself. You have various valves and things of that nature essentially bolted to this substrate. Portions of this substrate seem to be a manifold itself. So there's at least a base layer of integration here, and then I think this could be taken through and then significantly more integrated going forward. But this essentially coil of coolant and coolant pipes and fittings extends, wraps around here, and comes around the top, and then on at least, especially for vehicles that are all-wheel drive, some of this then continues onward to the top part, like a plane above the cradle itself. So it's kind of interesting. It seems like it's there, it's close, but we also seen this. The Mach-E, we saw, you know, essentially one nylon line, and then essentially everything else was EPDM, probably trying it out, seeing how it works, probably something very similar to here. Does this work? And then on the next iteration, they might go with more integration going forward. So that's one thing that's kind of interesting here, is just how tightly packed it is. Seems troublesome from an assembly perspective, but it almost looks like it is the first pass at potentially doing a more integrated manifold setup later down the line. So, we're both struggling with the short hoist here, so I'm just glad that someone's suffering with me. As we kind of come back to the cradle itself, one thing that's definitely different if you were to look at pictures of the all-wheel drive versions, there's more castings present. So clearly the one that we have here is a lower volume kind of consideration and a lower, at least capital heavy execution as well, with a heavy use of extrusions in the front cradle itself, with probably common portions here being casted for the all-wheel drive and rear-wheel drive unit, which makes sense to me, and then essentially anything else they're changing or essentially omitting from the version that does have a drive module in the front, there'll be casting supporting some of that. So it's interesting, makes sense to me. One thing that we have kind of noticed with some of our customers is, I think in general, the extrusion market is feeling essentially a shift over to using them heavily as the equipment press tonnage, I think that starts to dry up. So it's one of the things that some of our customers have challenges with, is getting competitive pricing on some of this stuff. So as you kind of come around here, Grace, you can just see a little bit of the difference in execution here, where on an all-wheel drive vehicle, this would essentially have a drive module there, and then they're kind of bracing and bringing this back. Yep. And kind of to my previous point, a casting, and then you have an extrusion here stacked upon another extrusion, and then with essentially a small extrusion here welded to prevent the steering rack from coming into the battery space. So very clear essentially where they're flexing aspects of common across potentially the Panamera as well, the Taycan, but more specifically what maybe is different between all-wheel drive and rear-wheel drive versions itself. Did you want to add anything?
No, not here. We can move on to...
One thing I do want to say before we go any further back, what is awesome about vehicles like this is just, you can see like all the dedicated brake cooling and routing through here. This side is missing some of it, but
if you come in this way,
yep. But you can essentially see how much emphasis there is on cooling both the low temperature radiators and keeping the brakes cool on this vehicle as well. Even though this is a base or a lower trim vehicle, it doesn't have essentially the 10 piston brakes that some of the higher
giant
the higher tiers do.
They look good.
This is a lowly 6-piston brake vehicle, which is pretty extensive regardless. For most vehicles that we look at, you know, we don't see a lot of this kind of execution. So
yeah. If you come this way here, we can show the brake ducts right here. And then you see this doesn't line up right now, but that's only because we're at full droop. Usually this shield here would line up with the duct very well, and then direct air into the brake package here. Interesting, when we look at the links here, we see that in the front it's mainly all forged links, and we have a hollow permanent mold with a sand cast core knuckle, right? So we have that in the rear as well. So they're not forged, but the hollow nature of them gives you very large sections, a lot of stiffness and weight efficiency. This wouldn't really lend itself well to a higher volume vehicle because it's you have the sand cores to remove, etc. So you'd probably go with something closer to a forged knuckle with higher volumes, but here it is the choice for Porsche. Very typical Porsche suspension. Actually, this vehicle doesn't have the air suspension, so we have coil over dampers. But actually, this Taycan is like almost the most base you can get.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have only rear drive. You don't have fancy active roll bars. The only real option that we saw, that Kevin and I looked up, is the set of wheels, right? And so if you go on the Porsche configurator, you will see that this wheel, it's a 21-inch and it's about $5,000, right? And we're in the costing space, so sometimes we think about components of how much they add in terms of profit, and these are maybe a 10x profit margin. So maybe it might cost $500 for the set of wheels, and they're selling them for $5,000, right? So, and that profit margin is comparable to what the average car in the US is sold.
Sure.
At like a 5% margin or so. So every time somebody specs these wheels, it's like selling a Ford Escape or something.
Sure.
Right? So it's interesting from that perspective. Moving to the back, we have the battery moved, and we see what looks like a transmission tunnel, right? But this is where a lot of the charging electronics are housed.
Correct.
And we see these depressions here that are, what do we call them? Foot garages?
Foot garages.
Foot garages, right.
Something also prevalent on the Lucid as well. Julian probably talk a little bit more in the battery video, but it's interesting to see, when we were looking at this, and we haven't seen the battery, it's in a separate part of the building. We had the foot garage here, as you can kind of see, and the first thing I was like, I'm surprised, I made a comment on, was I'm surprised essentially this doesn't continue over for section continuity. But immediately Julian in passing was like, well, they're running essentially an extruded L section through here, so this is the battery's portion of the responsibility for complementing the body structure itself. So it's kind of interesting. And he'll probably talk a little bit more about some of the trade-offs of the battery sizes, the presence of this foot garage, and just potentially, how architecturally this space has been claimed and how it differs from the Lucid and some of these other vehicles as they essentially start adding modules through the vehicle itself. But you can start to see essentially some difference in assembly strategy. So spot welds, very common, very inexpensive, and then you're starting to see SPRs or self-piercing rivets run down the sill here, where you're seeing essentially where steel is transitioning to aluminum in some places. You also see that across the back here as well, with some of these cross members running completely cross car and essentially closing out the backside of what we call the waterfall or the kick up. So on the extended range battery, there's I believe 2 additional modules that are parked up here. It is, I don't know, it's odd to me, Armin, that we still have kind of essentially a transmission tunnel. I mean, we've seen this holistically on some early PHEVs and things of that nature where they'll use this packaging space itself, but it's very interesting to me to see essentially the hard space claim in some areas of this vehicle, where I get it in the front here we have a lot of the high voltage electronics and battery module, and as we kind of move forward here, it's just interesting to me to see that this space claim is there. It makes me wonder from a performance perspective, is there something about the tunnel that is giving you some performance that Porsche likes, from a driving dynamics and body stiffness perspective.
Torsion rigidity.
It's clearly something that they obviously put a lot of effort into. I don't want to say I hate this, but I have many questions potentially about this cast aluminum bracket here that bolts in versus essentially, I get it, they're running brake lines, under this per se, but to me, just it seems very odd and very complex versus something that has been integrated, spot welded, and brought across, and then running the brake lines down and over. One thing I've noticed just looking at this, and at either flanking side, so the fore side and aft side of the battery, and you'll see kind of a very interesting aspect of the Porsche execution, is just how tightly everything is packaged, just in general. So when you look at all the stack ups, essentially these mounts here for the sway bars, the various points of how they're being bolted. So this is obviously being built offline as a sub-assembly. So it's interesting to me to see the stack up, and it's clear that this is not a high volume vehicle. Mm-hmm. This is you'd never see anything like this on a Toyota or anything like that. Not because they can't do it. It's not conducive for high volume and low takt times.
Yeah, you probably don't see this on a Cayenne either.
No.
Or a Macan. Yeah.
So it's just interesting. Again, as I kind of mentioned, I've never really had a chance to look at a Porsche, so it's kind of the first time seeing it. Ashburn, maybe down the line, if money becomes not a problem, I'll try and get a 911 at some point, but we'll see. So as we move rearward in the vehicle, one thing that's kind of interesting is the use of EPP, or expanded polypropylene foam, to kind of insulate the rear drive module from the cabin space itself. I just haven't seen it used in this particular area of the vehicle. There's nothing wrong with it per se. It's relatively inexpensive, but it's just interesting to see. But if you kind of want to come, maybe look this way, Grace. As we get to the rear drive module, the cradle itself, is relatively conventional, kind of what we expected to see with respect to castings on the end, extrusions coming across and being welded. But one of the things that's very interesting is essentially this battery brace here. So there is a bent extrusion that's running across the top, 2 castings that are picking up off of essentially drive module mounts for the rear EDM, and the battery itself is mounting to this. So the isolation and part of essentially supporting the rear drive module is piggybacking off of the battery structure itself, which kind of lends itself to the fact that it is an integral part of the body stiffness, but it's very interesting to see this execution here. It's very tight, and I can honestly say I've never seen anything like this. It's interesting as we kind of work through the rear suspension. You'll see kind of where the rear sway bars are. Again, kind of my previous point. Castings bolted to another casting, which is bolted to another casting, and you have multi-axes kind of going on here. Not uncommon with building big sub-assemblies, but some areas make me think there's potentially some opportunity for some more integration, but it's definitely a unique execution. I can honestly say I've never seen anything like this, where we have essentially a supplementary bracket coming off the battery itself that nests and is packaged or decked potentially separately with the cradle. I don't think it necessarily is, but it's very, very interesting to see how discrete this path is on supporting the rear battery itself. Yeah, for sure. But this is also see how the drive shafts are routed through the subframe right here with this casting. These castings are hollow as well, right? Just like the spring link here. So they are making use of this casting technology throughout the vehicle in order to gain some weight efficiencies. And one curious thing that Kevin and I have noticed in the back here is the use of a faux anti-roll bar, right? So if you come here and take a look straight at this bar, we see that actually it's still rubber isolated. It looks like a sway bar, but it doesn't, it ends in that space, right? So if you look at my finger right here, it just stops, and usually you'd have the lever of the ARB come up this way, and then the end link connects to and shares this damper bottom bolt, right? Which actually we like very much, that this has a dual function. When there is a anti-roll bar or functional anti-roll bar spec to the vehicle, but here, for some reason, Porsche found it necessary to retain the bar section of the ARB, right? So, and we've been speculating why that might be, and it may be related to manufacturing or crash. Maybe the anti-roll bar absorbed some rear crash energy, and then without it, it just didn't quite meet their internal goals, and so they just said, oh, throw the bar back in. But definitely curious. I haven't seen that before. No, so. I haven't. I mean, and again, if we were to look at it, just the packaging itself, and it's hard to see. It's unfortunate that we're not going to be able to take more of the vehicle down or apart to see essentially these cradles live separately from the body, look at the body without the cradles, look at the cradles themselves, isolated and drop down. But just a lot of complexity again. It's what's very, I mean, you can see here the isolators for the body. So it has like a dog bone style bolt here, bolt on the other side. It goes across this bracket here that's bolting in the back of the drive module itself. And then, as you kind of Armin mentioned, you're seeing this whole stanchion here that's just for the ARB bar mount itself on the cradle. It's still isolated, there's still an isolator in there. They have another cast cap going over it. And then essentially this cool double shear bracket that's also supporting, it's going to the body, like kind of the trunk area itself here, running across, but also helping with the main rear pickup point here for the cradle to kind of give it more stiffness. One thing that I think is kind of interesting, I'm not sure off the top of my head though, is there any other EVs that have a 2-speed gearbox?
No, as far as I know, this is the only one,
yeah.
Right? So
there's a lot of interesting things, about the motor itself, unique windings and kind of their power density. I think it's based off some of their racing platforms. But in general, it's kind of what I would expect to see from a first generation EV from anyone, especially a company that prides itself on performance. There may be a lot of compromises that we're seeing from a manufacturing side, that they're prioritizing performance or potentially low volume, build processes over integration. But there is just a lot of disassociated components. Now, granted, there's a 2-speed gearbox, but the inverters aren't integrated. And same thing if you were to look at any images of the front drive module itself, in my mind, kind of a very typical disassociated, stacks of modules, separate wiring harnesses going through there. So I definitely think there's opportunity as the EV Porsches go forward, but in general, it's very interesting to see how different this is than some of our other vehicles that we have seen. It's in a whole separate kind of category vehicle, price class of vehicle, and I'm glad we got the chance to see it. So I'm very pleased. I know we can't show a lot more of it, but we at least got to show you this part and then the battery going forward in the future. So.
Just spotted. This is kind of interesting too, that the ride height sensor is packaged into the hollow void of the subframe, right? If you look in here, it's kind of clever for packaging. You see that the potentiometer that's housed in this molding right here that attaches to this lever is actually inside, right? So keeps it away from the spring. Nice packaging. It's always nice to see. So yeah, just a little detail here. But yeah, overall, a lot of stuff going on, right? And it's just a function of volume and being a first generation of electric vehicle. So this is sort of what we generally see, and it's always interesting to see where it goes from here, right? In terms of being more refined, maybe a little bit more like certain specific EV manufacturers, right? So
yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to see. Where Porsche places its emphasis, and one thing that we're not seeing essentially is obviously the battery's been de-decked in the vehicle, but the entire body is covered with aero shields, essentially straight from the front all the way back. So there's just in general, we have brake cooling ducts, lots of effort, in the vehicle to direct air for both cooling of the vehicle, cooling of its braking system and chassis systems, and just managing airflow, over the vehicle itself.
It does have a very good CD. I think it's 0.022.
I think so.
So it's right on par with Tesla Model S, and so yeah.
It's very interesting, and most people, if you look at essentially various other car reviews, people are doing a little bit more dynamic testing. I mean, many hail it as essentially one of the best driving, EVs that's on the market today.
Yeah,
so.
And that's sort of a function, right? When you talk about vehicle dynamics in EVs, yes, you have a very good CG and you have very good control over your motors and your positive torque. But these Taycans, often when you hear those reviews, they have this unbelievable array of dynamic aids, right? Active roll bars, active suspension, dampening, and so I would be interested to hear what people say about a base vehicle like this, right? Because from that perspective, it's quite normal, right? It's just static roll bars, spring over coils, probably not even adaptive dampers. So yeah, very interesting. But Taycan is definitely the sports car in the EV sedan world.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. So did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I think that might be it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate you watching. And we're very fortunate to have the chance to look at this vehicle. Again, we can't show you more of it aside from the battery, but we've been wanting, I know Eric has wanted to see a Porsche Taycan forever. It's like his dream
They're cool
vehicle.
cars.
Yes, so it's nice to finally have the chance to actually see one and just see the difference and be able to show you guys the difference in essentially a manufacturer that is known for performance, good chassis dynamics, and essentially builds a vehicle in arguably a completely different segment than what we typically work with. So just interesting to see the differences there. So thank you very much, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.